So welcome to this session on masculinity and gender justice, the role of public and private sectors. It is indeed an honor for me to have such a distinguished panel here. We have with us Vijay Chadha, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Bharti Foundation on my left, the philanthropic arm of Bharti Enterprise, and it was set up with a vision to help underprivileged children and young people of our country realize their potential, and they run a range of 254 rural schools across 6 states of India, with a reach out to close to 40,000 children and 1,500 teachers on their roll. So we can see the huge canvas within which they're operating and the impact that we can have with them if we partner with them down the line. We also have with us on my right Nalin Mehta, who's a social scientist, writer and a journalist, at the moment a consulting expert with the Times of India, one of the well-known papers in India for those that are from outside of India, and an adjunct professor of media studies at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. And we look forward to having him to speak from the standpoint of how media relates to some of these complex issues and what is the role they can play onwards. To my extreme right there, we have my very dear colleague, Tulika Srivastav, who's a very well-known human rights lawyer, both within the country and internationally. She is an institution builder, has built several organizations, including Ali in Lucknow, and is currently the executive director of the South Asia Women's Fund and serves as the co-chair of the International Network of Women's Fund. So welcome all of you to the panel. We do hope it will be an intensive dialogue, considering that we are a good small group of people here. And I am Sunita Dhar, and I work with a women's collective, an organization called Jagori. Please welcome. Let me start off the conversation on what we're going to have our panelists speak. Each one of them will begin with their opening remarks, and then we'll pick up some more questions down the line, and then we will open up to the audience, right? And I know that to respect the time of everyone's time, we will close at 12:30. I just want to say a few things, that in this conference, we've had a lot of interesting conversations in the last 3 days. There are participants from 94 countries doing very, very amazing work on different sites and locations. A lot of the conversations have come up regarding the fact that we should not look at gender only as masculinity and femininity, but break the binaries and go beyond looking at men and women in their classical gender roles and modes, but look at the diversity of gendered and sexual identities that exist in society, so that we don't fall into traps of dominant paradigms and frameworks, but we are able to unpack and see that not everybody is the same, and not everybody's experiences and structures within which they operate are the same, both at the level of the individual, the collective, and the legal frameworks that operate in the country. We also need to look at those that are invisible to the discourse and are located on the margins of our society. There has been a lot of discussion on the neoliberal framework and capitalist patriarchy that has created a new form of violent masculinities, and need to move away from the naturalization of a dominant form of masculinity that seems to have become the norm. We have to examine the complex social, religious, and political factors that create the forms of masculinities that lead to increased levels of crimes and threats against women, discrimination, inequalities, and also through the fact that new forms of and cultures of violence are created through a new set of norms that are couched in language of honor and tradition, and this is our culture. So we need to start contesting many of those and result in using these notions of traditional values to limit women and girls' mobility, autonomy, and voice. And we need to look at that. That not all men are silent, not all men are complicit. Many of them are allies in the process. Many of them are struggling to define themselves in supporting agendas of women in education, ending violence against women, also in their personal lives, taking on the division of labor within their homes, being caring parents, is something that we need to also portray, and we need to recognize, and we need to nurture and value, so that with these champions and with these allies, we can move ahead with a different way of changing our societies. However, in the context of India, while we are aspiring and are number 2, number 3, somewhere on the economic canvas, we have huge deficits when it comes to gender. I don't need to tell you the statistics. We have the latest data that has come out of the World Economic Forum that puts us at 114 in our ranking, and several other issues that are being examined. Not to say that we have not made gains, we certainly have made gains. However, in recent times there have been some comments that have been disturbing across the world. We had the CEO of Microsoft just a month ago say that women should not ask for a pay raise. Their good karma will take care of them. And now that he has apologized, he's also looking at the fact that there are pay inequalities within his own institution and within all the institutions, the finance institutions world over. I have just looked up at the statistics in USA and find that women get 78 cents to every dollar that the man earns. Another data says that men with the same graduate degrees as women, which is bachelor degrees, earn 40% more than women. So then the question is, we have to cross that barrier quickly. We've also heard a lot of comments from politicians in our country. Boys will be boys. It is the girls who are responsible, and invite rapes against them. And we need to counter this concept of reducing crimes against women to them being responsible for their own safety and for the norms that accompany it. This session will examine the need and relevance of understanding masculinities and what are the kinds of interventions that are being designed within very different spaces. Now, we're not necessarily in activist spaces, and we were very honored to have the media, a corporate philanthropic foundation, a South Asia Women's Philanthropy as well, to look at how do they design institutional policies, how do they address these issues, what are some of the dreams and imaginations that they are bringing to their work as they learn to address these issues. We're also looking at what are the kinds of conversations they have within their institutional spaces, what are the practices and accountability measures, and what are the investments they make to address these issues. Thank you, and I will start with the panel. I will call upon Mr. Chadha to please start. Okay, no problem. Let us start with you, Nalin. With your opening remarks, go to Tulika, and then we'll come to you, Mr. Chadha. Thank you.
Is working? Yeah. Thanks very much. Let me just start by saying that women and issues of gender and masculinity is not something I work on a daily basis, so I'm not an expert by any stretch of imagination. So, and I don't know the jargon, and I don't know some of the issues that you people would be very familiar with, so apologize for that. But when I was asked to speak here, I thought I'd sort of turn the lens on what I do on a daily basis and speak from that experience, which is basically to deal with grubby politicians, with very boring regulators and bureaucrats, and sometimes with sports people, and also the media industry in general, and speak from that vantage point on the issues that Sunita has delineated. We were talking yesterday on what would be useful to speak about at a forum like this, and I told her that I wanted to start by speaking about the Tehelka case, and her antennas immediately went up, because many of you have followed the Tehelka case, some of you have been involved with it in some way or the other. Now, I don't intend to speak at all about whether Mr. Tejpal was guilty or not. That's a matter for the courts. But what I want to start by speaking about is the implications of that case on the media industry in general, and what that tells us about attitudes about masculinity and gender in the media industry in general. Now, particularly because at the time when the case happened, I was heading one of the major news channels, and we had a whole debate about it, and it made us really think about such issues in the workplace. When the matter was first reported, and I think most of you would be familiar with the details of the case, so I won't repeat them here. When it was first reported on television, it had been around in the blogosphere, it had been around in rumor mills for a while, but when it was first reported as a news story on NDTV first reported it, we in our newsroom had a big debate about it, on whether we should report it as well, and how we should report it. And I think the first thing that came across to me was that a lot of people in the newsroom were very uncomfortable about reporting the case, primarily because at that point, and I'm talking about the first day when the first report came out, primarily because I think in the media industry there's normally, with few honorable exceptions, almost a code of omerta on when there are matters of your own. So there was a reluctance about that. One. Two, and also a lot of people knew Tarun very well, and people weren't sure what to believe and what not to believe. But there's also a general reluctance to report on your own. One. Two, I think, as one of my editors pointed out to me, one of my senior editors pointed out to me, that look, the case, there's been no police report yet. So what we have right now are two versions. We have a version from Tarun and we have a version from the alleged victim. We do not know where it stands, so it's a matter between these two and their organization, so we should stay out of it. We debated this for a while, and that night, the channels that I was running at that time, both the two channels, we did not carry that news, simply because we wanted to know more. And my view, eventually, after having this concerted debate was, rightly or wrongly, in retrospect, that let's get some more details, let's report the facts as we know it, let's not report an innuendo and rumor and so on. By the next morning, the case was all over the papers. Two channels had gone very strong with it. One was NDTV, and after some time CNN IBN late at night. We mentioned it sort of 12, 10, 30, 11 at night. Next morning, the second rule of media came into play, which is the herd instinct. Once something becomes big enough, then all these usual debates you have, they go out of the window, and then you can't not miss that story. And my view in the first night had been, we can't afford not to miss it, but let's be careful, let's find out more details, and then we report it responsibly. The next morning, all the rules went out of the window, and for the next 5 days, on television in particular, or newspapers to a great degree, no other news mattered. This was the story that ran India for the next 4 or 5 days. What did it tell us? What did it say about the media industry in particular? I remember interviewing Shoma Chaudhary on the second or third day of this media circus. It was a live television interview for 45 minutes, and we put before her all the usual questions. Why did you not report it? What did you do when this case first came to you? Did you follow the Vishaka guidelines? Why did you not have a Vishaka guideline committee in your office? And she answered them all fairly adroitly. She was she had done a couple of interviews, but then she'd spoken to Rajdeep by that time. She had spoken on Z. She knew these were the questions. She answered them fairly well. But then when I put this, there was a point in the interview when she broke down, and that was when I put it to her that, look, Shoma, you've been identified as, in your career, you've campaigned hard and written strongly about women's issues. Somebody who's, you certainly are aware about all of these issues. You are certainly aware of the Vishaka guidelines and of the law which was passed in April 2013. So how could it be that you didn't know about it? How could it be that you are now ironically being seen as someone who's trying to brush this under the carpet, irrespective of the veracity of the allegations? Why did you not follow the law? And that's when she broke down. And to me, at that point when she broke down on live television, my first instinct as an evil journalist was, wow, that my interview's made, she's crying, I've touched a raw chord. There's nothing that speaks better on television than raw emotion, much more than words can do. But when the interview got over, I was driving back, and I thought to myself that, well, it's all very well to question Shoma, who ran a small office, on why did you not have these procedures in place. But do we as a large organization have these procedures in place? I had just started running the channel about 2 or 3 months before that. I have to say, I wasn't aware of at that point of time whether we had those structures in place or not. So I called up my HR head and I said, look, do we have a Vishaka committee? Do we have these structures in place? And they said, yes, we do. And I was assured in very strong terms. And the lady and she was a woman, by the way. And she said, look, we've got all these things. The emails have gone out in the past. We've got all the structures in place. So I was a bit assured. But then, of course, the next day in my next news meeting, I think all the women in that news meeting got up and said, look, they asked me the same question, that do we have these committees? And I said, yes, of course we do. And, the HR, talked to the HR, they all have it. And they said, yeah, but and some of these women had worked in that organization for 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, and they had no idea about the committee. neither did they know who to approach when and if they had an issue. So that to me immediately brought home to me a dichotomy between what management says, and I did check up. We did have those procedures. There was a composition, there were people who were nominated, and I was assured that everybody down the chain knew about it, but of course they didn't in practice. Or it was one of those forgotten emails that went and then everyone forgot about it. And so what I saw happening in the next 2 days was suddenly a lot of people by their own effort, and some of these were men by the way, actually most of these were men, then started printing out copies of the Vishaka guidelines, started putting them on notice boards, not on the official notice board, but on the workspaces of where we worked within the newsroom. Partly it was a joke that, some of it, it was a half joke, it was serious, that one of our political editor, for example, said, look, just to be sure, I don't want to be caught in any half-meaning, half-innuendo conversation, so I'm putting these guidelines up, so make sure you don't make a mistake. And it was put up all around the newsroom. So that I think was one direct impact of this case. It made a lot of us question ourselves, one. Two, if you look at the media industry in general now, you would find most big media houses have committees, they have sexual harassment policies in place, they have all of that in place. But I think there is an issue of it being part of your intrinsic DNA or not, because I don't think it is. In general, I would argue that there's been no study on comprehensive study on the media industry and the role, and the policies for women or issues around gender and masculinity. 79 tried to do a study when she was heading the Women's Press Corps, but it was never finished. Partly because a lot of people are reluctant to talk about it. I think when you compare the media to other corporate industries, you would find that women are generally more represented at higher levels. And I'm speaking only anecdotally, there's no evidence I have to back this up. Particularly at television, if you look at companies like NDTV and so on, it's generally better represented than most other companies. And I think there are equal pay and so on. Companies like NDTV are very, very progressive in terms of maternity leave and so on. But one of the things that I found, I've come back to India after 10 years of living overseas. I used to work for the UN in Geneva, and when I had a child, I could, living in Geneva, take a month of paternity leave. When I came back and I had my second child in here working in a television station in Delhi, I was told I could only take 1 day off. And I'm not even talking about what was eligible for the woman, because for women, then I checked up the policies, and for women we had a policy for 3 or 4 weeks. Companies like NDTV have 7-8 months, and then you can get flexible time and so on. Now, because I was in a senior position, I could afford to take longer time, but it wasn't part of the policy, and I think that's a structural problem we have. I don't have enough evidence to talk about other companies, and there has been no study about it, but that's so. While the media is very much a mouthpiece for women's equality, for gender issues and so on, it has been at the forefront of all of these issues. I think very often it doesn't look too much as much within as it should, and that's true for most other issues as well, not just for these issues. The second point I wanted to speak about, and we can do a question answer about this later. Okay, yeah. How much time do I have? 2 minutes?
Okay, take 2 minutes. We have one speaker less, so everybody.
Okay.
2 minutes.
The second one I wanted to speak about is, recently the CEO of Apple, Tom Cook, came out. Look around you, and are there any Indian CEOs who do that? No. Would they even want to do that? No. Would they all be heterosexual? Absolutely not. And I think the difference here, and Kanika Datta has written about this very persuasively recently, that in the United States, much of the socially progressive policies which corporate America follows in the workplace, it's been far ahead of regulation on this. And it's created an environment where someone like Tom Cook could come out openly and not fear any retribution or any kind of opprobrium. For example, a lot of US companies, a lot of the top corporate companies in America have given benefits to same-sex child benefits or pension benefits to same-sex couples long before it was made in law. In fact, one of the reasons why the Defense of Marriage Act was repealed in 2013 in the United States was because companies like Google, like Facebook, like Starbucks officially directly lobbied the US government to remove the strictures of this act which forbade them from giving benefits to same-sex couples. And I think corporate America has followed it, not for necessarily for altruistic purposes, but because they are more in line with social trends, because it helps them do better business. It helps them keep the employees happier by being in line with this. I don't think corporate India has done that. I think corporate India has been very good with adopting a lot of business practices, by doing a lot of transformational change. But I think on social issues, it's not done as much on these. It's done a lot of things, like, and we'll hear about Bharti very soon. It's done a lot of stuff on safe issues, children, and all of those. But on these, which are social fault lines, if you like, it hasn't done so. Partly because of the law, Section 377 and so on. But I think it needs to do more. I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got a little note. I'm just going to take 30 seconds, Tulika, because I have been told from somebody in the audience that people may not understand what is the Shaka guidelines on Tehilka. Just to tell you that Tehilka is a magazine, and if you Google, you'll get to know that the case that he's already talked about, that it is in court right now. And Vishaka guidelines are the guidelines that women's groups have got here in 1997 to address sexual harassment at the workplace, based on experiences of one of our colleagues on the ground in Rajasthan. And now we also have an act called the Sexual Harassment Act of 2013. So you can Google and get to know more. May I invite Tulika, please?
Thank you, Sunita. Thank you, Snalin, for such a wonderful start on that. Just to say, I'm one of the naysayers, doom speakers, nervous people when men and boys engage symposium was being discussed. Because I do believe, by the way, that human rights are everybody's business, not just men and boys or women, everybody's business. And I think there is a certain politics and a certain rationale when we put identities or when we talk about certain communities, because there is an understanding of their vulnerabilities, their marginalization, their oppression, which is the reason why we say Dalit women or black women or black men, and because it indicates the oppression they have suffered because of the identity they bear, or their relationship with development. As if you look at, say, the women's movements across the world, there is a rationale for talking about women, and there is a rationale why gender was, by Sunita and by my other mentors, was framed as a tool to help us understand why disadvantage happens. So when I see gender being used as an issue, I'm very confused. The other piece that I just want to just raise very shortly is that we do need to, I do believe, and I'm also a strong advocate of saying that we do need to unpackage the men and boys piece. We need to see which men, which boys, and where are they located when we're talking about them. Because clearly it's not the Martians that come down and lay down the policy and rape women. They're also men and boys, yeah? So where is that coming from? Because and men themselves suffer rape and are unable to talk about it. So where are those silences coming from? What is the history? What are the stories? What the obstacles that we tend to address when we talk about human rights? So just having put those two caveats in place, very quickly I will go to, I want to talk about the public sector and the private sector and the roles we're looking at them to play within the framework of what we call gender justice. Though I would just rather talk about justice. As Nalin pointed out earlier, that when we are talking about public sector and private sector, we're talking about actors that occupy that space and their role therein towards ensuring there's justice for all. And when we talk justice for all, as a philanthropist, as South Asia Women's Fund, I will talk about resources. So when we're looking at public sector, most of the resources that have come to fund women's rights work, and speaking from the India experience, I think one of the biggest programs for rural women has been the Mahila Samakhya. Has come very much from very education, very development, and a very empowerment paradigm. The feminists who have interpreted that and who have implemented that have innovated and have reinterpreted and have pushed the envelope. But the sources themselves have been fairly conservative. And as somebody whose business now is to basically look at how do we put in more resources in a sustained manner into fulfilling the mandate and the agenda for women's rights, I see it as critical that the policies actually enable women's groups. And at the moment in 2014, what we're seeing is a real crisis where women's organizations are being closed down, that they are losing money, that the way in which the funding used to be sourced has disappeared, and we're getting more and more into what a study that South Asia Women's Fund conducted between 2011 and 2012, which is the resources, rights and claims and shares of women in South Asia, are showing us that we're getting very much into the aid effectiveness strategy. Show us the scale quickly, very quickly. Show us the scale, show us the impact. Oh my God, horrific rape, let's give money to rape. Let's put money in there, let's get everybody on that. But where is the sustained funding for actually making sure that women's organizations can walk the talk, are able to be there, that the issues of agency, the issues of decision making, that the issues of voices don't get left behind. Recently at a workshop of philanthropists, when I and Anisha, my colleague who's in the audience today, introduced ourselves as South Asia Women's Fund with a special focus on women's organizations and building women's voices, we were told it's unfair. So we were a little nervous. Why is it unfair? I said, you should fund everybody. You should just fund the work. And actually, in ideal world, I would like to do that. I would like to just fund the work for women's rights. But there is a reason, there is a politics to funding women to do their work. There is a politics that Dalit groups need to be funded as Dalit groups to do their work for human rights. Yeah? So similarly, we have to make sure that those spaces don't get taken away. And there needs to be a commitment that the politics of the public sector actually enables this and the private sector invests in this. At the moment, coming from Sri Lanka, the company as in South Asia Women's Fund is registered in Sri Lanka, and we are a virtual office. We work in 5 countries. And I can tell you, donors are actually leaving Sri Lanka because it's now a mid-level entry country. India is still interesting and fascinating because of our rapes, and our rapes and our rapes and our rapes. But Sri Lanka, well, there are no rapes, at least not the ones there are rapes, but they're not in the media. So, you see, the donors can, with a safe conscience, leave because development is happening, health indicators are good. But you're not looking at what women's rights organizations are doing. They're not looking at how women's agencies are being undermined, that abortion is still illegal, that sexual rights are still illegal. And there is no funding, zip funding. There's one little funding who's sitting there. And then, we need to also look at how to build those political voices. So my worry, and I'm saying this very frankly in the men's and boys engage conference, is that we began with the development agenda 40 years ago. We went to empowerment. We were then through black days of gender mainstreaming. Finally, we found feminist issues, and we may lose them again. And I'm scared. Because if we dilute the women's agenda to only a development agenda, and I know, and I'm, really it's a privilege, Mr. Chadda, to have you on the panel when we talk about education, when we talk about girl child education. But at the same time, the corporate sector has to recognize, and I really admire that input from you, Nalin, when you talked about how the US actually went into social policies and social constructions. And how do we do that? How do we make sure our corporates understand, our corporations understand where the investments have to happen? And the CSR debate is hotting up as we speak. But if we look, and we did do a CSR policy review, and that's also on our website, which is www.sawf.info, which is a CSR philanthropy research, which shows very clearly that the corporates, we're not even 120th in the list of issues. Yeah? So resources are the pink elephant in the room. We're not talking about it, but it's serious. There is a crisis. Women's organizations are closing down. And how do we, as the larger public, ensure that that doesn't happen? That the political voices of women are not silenced. Yeah? That's, I think, where I'm at.
Thank you, Tulika. I think both Nalin and Tulika have raised some very profound issues. both in terms of reflecting from within their institutional spaces, but also raising those very critical questions on which with which we should engage if we want to transform and work towards an agenda together. I'd like to invite